Welcome, dear listener, and thank you for joining me on another gentle voyage through the past, where history unfolds like a lullaby and the centuries drift by like waves under a quiet moon. Tonight, we'll drift across the salt-stung winds of the open sea, and descend into the creaking, tar-soaked decks of a pirate ship, not the glamorous kind sung about in tavern ballads, but the real, splinter-ridden world of daily survival beneath black sails. We'll then follow the infamous Blackbeard through smoke and shadow, explore the secrets of a treasure-laden shipwreck beneath the Atlantic, and finally, climb the polished steps of a colonial governor's mansion, where power dressed itself in silk and whispered through candlelit halls. This is not a tale of adventure and excitement, but of endurance, discomfort, and the quiet rhythm of human life at sea and on shore, as it once was, and is now long gone. So now, let your breath slow, feel the weight of the day soften around your shoulders, and gently imagine yourself transported, with a role you probably wouldn't wish for, and wouldn't endure for long. Picture this, it's the year 1716, and you, a wiry, undersized boy of perhaps 12 or 13, have just been hauled aboard a pirate sloop in the turquoise waters of the Caribbean. You didn't ask for this life. Perhaps you were taken from a captured merchant vessel, or perhaps, desperate and alone, you volunteered at the wrong dockside tavern in Kingston, not quite knowing what you were agreeing to. Regardless, you now belong to the crew, or, rather, you belong to the ship, is your world. Your bed is a thin roll of canvas or an empty coil of rope tucked in a corner below deck, where the air hangs thick with damp wood, sweat, and the ever-present tang of tar. There is no real privacy, just shadows and hammocks and the shuffle of bare feet at all hours. The wooden beams creak overhead, rats scurry freely in the hold. You're often woken not by sunlight, but by shouted curses, crashing waves, or the sound of a man vomiting into a bucket after too much rum. Your day begins before the sun lifts fully over the horizon. The first task is usually fetching water, stale, brackish water from a barrel that's slowly growing moss on the inside. It's still drinkable, technically, though every sip carries a faint bitterness, like mold and dust. Then comes the work. As a cabin boy, you are everywhere and nowhere. You fetch the captain's messages. You scrub the deck until your fingers are raw. You run errands for grizzled men who wear more scars than shirts, dodging slaps and boots in the occasional thrown mug. There are no set meals. Food is whatever can be cooked from the dwindling stores. Salt pork, often riddled with grubs. Ship's biscuit, more weevil than wheat. Dried peas that haven't been green in months. The cook makes stew, boiling up stews in a blackened pot that never truly smells clean. You eat fast and in silence, unless someone is in the mood for a crude joke or a song, often both. And hygiene, it's not really a concern. You bathe when it rains. You relieve yourself over the side of the ship or in a shared bucket. Your shirt, if you're lucky enough to own one, is stiff with sweat and salt. Lice are common. Infection is expected. If you cut your hand or scrape your foot, you simply hope it doesn't fester. If it does, you pretend it doesn't hurt. Showing weakness invites attention you don't want. Storms come frequently, and when they do, the deck becomes a slippery, howling chaos of wind and water. You tie yourself to a beam or hang on with white knuckles. You've seen a man swept clean over the railing before. Just gone, like a piece of paper into the breeze. No one shouted. No one prayed. No longer part of the ship. And then, there's discipline. Despite what the stories say, pirate ships did have rules. Strict ones, but enforcement varied. A cabin boy was easy to punish. A sharp cuff to the back of the head for dropping a rope. A kick for sleeping too long. A week without food for backtalk. And yet, for all its misery, the pirate ship is strangely alive. There is a rhythm to its suffering, a pattern to its days. There are moments, between the toil and the salt spray, when the ocean quiets, when gulls circle gently above, when the sails flutter in a warm breeze, and the ship glides smooth as glass, over a sapphire sea. In those rare moments, you might lie on the upper deck, watching clouds move, wondering what land is like, or if you'll ever see it again. Night falls quickly on the ocean. The crew quiets. A lantern swings overhead. You curl against the side of a barrel, the planks beneath you still warm from the sun. Somewhere a man hums a low tune. The waves lap steadily, rhythmically, against the hull. It's another day survived, and tomorrow, you'll scrub the deck again. Let's shift now, from the dim, salt-warm deck of a pirate sloop, to the brooding shadow of one of history's most mythologized figures. a man known to the world as Blackbeard. Not just a name, of course, but a legend, a silhouette, a whisper through centuries of maritime lore. But who was he, truly, and what can we understand if we look beyond the smoke, the beard, and the fear? His real name, as best we can tell, was Edward Teach, or possibly Edward Thatch, as spellings were fluid in those days. He likely hailed from Bristol, England, a port city where the scent of fish mingled with tobacco smoke and the docks groaned with the weight of colonial commerce. He may have served on British privateers during the War of the Spanish Succession, cutting his teeth quietly at first on the dangerous life at sea. But his legend doesn't begin until around 1716, when he joins the crew of a notorious pirate named Benjamin Hornigold. Hornigold sees potential in the tall, imposing young man, and soon, Edward commands his own vessel, a small sloop, fast and nimble. What sets Blackbeard apart is not just his violence. In fact, there's little proof he killed many people personally, but his deliberate use of fear as a tool of control. He cultivated a persona. Imagine him tall, broad-shouldered, with a wild beard he deliberately braided and tied with black ribbons. Before battle, he'd tuck slow-burning fuses under his hat, so his head would smolder in a cloud of smoke. His coat was heavy with pistols, crisscrossed across his chest like a grim parody of military order. To a merchant crew facing a sudden confrontation at sea, this was not a man, but a phantom, a demon of the deep. His most infamous vessel was the Queen Anne's Revenge, a former French slave ship. Blackbeard captured and outfitted with 40 cannons. Under his command, she became a floating fortress of intimidation. He roamed the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, and the American coastline, targeting merchant vessels with precision. But Blackbeard didn't simply sack and destroy. More often, he blockaded. He negotiated. He allowed ships to surrender without bloodshed. His terror lay in what might happen, not what always did. In 1718, he orchestrated his most daring act, a blockade of Charleston, South Carolina. For nearly a week, no ships entered or left. He even seized a ship carrying local elites and held them for ransom. Not for gold, but for medical supplies, including mercury and syringes, likely to treat venereal disease among his crew. He got what he wanted, and sailed away. But Blackbeard was never meant for quiet retirement. Governor Alexander Spotswood of Virginia, disturbed by Blackbeard's growing influence and the failure of the North Carolina governor to act, took matters into his own hands. He sent Lieutenant Robert Maynard, a naval officer, with orders to eliminate the pirate menace once and for all. The confrontation came on November 22nd, 1718, near Creaking Island. It was a morning battle, short and violent. Blackbeard's men were outnumbered and outgunned. Teach himself was shot multiple times and slashed across the body before he fell. It's said he endured 5 gunshot wounds and over 20 cuts before finally collapsing. His head was severed and hung from the bow of Maynard's ship. A grim display meant to end a legend, but in truth, it only cemented it. Stories grew. That Blackbeard swam around his ship 3 times after his death. That he buried treasure no one has ever found. That his ghost haunts the Outer Banks, searching for his severed head under the light of the moon. Yet behind the tailies, we see something else. A clever, strategic man who understood the power of image, of psychology, and of spectacle. A man who, perhaps, killed less than others, but frightened more, because he knew how fear could rule better than a sword ever could. He was not a hero, nor was he the devil the British crown painted him to be. He was a man of his time, and then he was gone. But the waves still remember. As the tide of our journey continues, let us now drift beneath the surface, into the silence of the ocean floor, to explore one of the most fascinating archaeological finds in maritime history. The wreck of a pirate ship. A real one. It was called the Widder Galley, a vessel born not in legend, but in the ledgers and docks of the 18th century. Built in London in 1715 as a slave ship, she was designed for speed and capacity, made to ferry human cargo between the coasts of West Africa, the Caribbean, and the colonies of North America. Her name, Widow, was taken from a port on the coast of what is now Benin, a place tied deeply to the slave trade. The ship made just one run across the Atlantic before everything changed. In early 1717, the Widow was captured off the Bahamas by a pirate named Samuel Black, Sam Bellamy. Bellamy was no ordinary pirate. He was young only in his late 20s, and known to his men as both daring and democratic. He had previously been a sailor in the British Navy and then a privateer, but like many, he turned to piracy after the war ended and wages dried up. He was famously charismatic and often voted to share plunder more fairly among his crew, a sharp contrast to the harsh inequalities of the merchant or naval life. They called him the Pirate Prince. After capturing the Widow, Bellamy refitted it to be his flagship. He armed it with 28 cannons and used it to chase down and take other vessels, quickly amassing a fleet and a fortune. But it wouldn't last. On the night of April 26, 1717, the Widow ran headlong into a violent nor'easter off the coast of Cape Cod. The ship, weighed down with stolen treasure and likely unfamiliar with the tricky shallows of the area, broke apart in the storm. Bellamy and nearly all of his crew were killed. Only 2 men survived. The rest, along with over 4.5 tons of silver, gold, and valuable cargo, were swallowed by the sea. For centuries, the Widow remained a ghost ship, a whispered tale of treasure lost to the deep. But in 1984, maritime explorer Barry Clifford discovered something extraordinary. While scanning the waters near Wellfleet, Clifford and his team located a wreck that would, after years of verification, be confirmed as the Widow Galley, the only authenticated pirate shipwreck ever discovered. What lay beneath the sand and silt was a time capsule from the golden age of piracy. There were cannonballs and weapons, navigational tools, personal belongings, coins from around the globe, jewelry, trade, beads, even a boy's shoe. Each item spoke in quiet tones about the people who had once lived aboard that ship. Not just pirates, but a complex mix of sailors from many nations. Africans, Europeans, possibly escaped indentured servants. Some willingly there, some not. The Widow was a pirate ship, but it was also a relic of the wider world it sailed through. A world of trade, exploitation, rebellion, and dreams dashed against the shore. Among the most haunting finds were the iron shackles, reminders of the ship's former life, when it carried not treasure, but people, shackled, taken, sold. Even in its pirate days, the ship's dark past remained embedded in its wood and iron. Today, many of the widest artifacts are housed in a museum in Massachusetts. A carefully curated collection balances the thrill of pirates with the sobering context of their world. And still, not everything has been found. The sea keeps secrets, but every coin, every broken pistol, every weathered artifact pulled from that sand whispers the same quiet message. That history lives not only in stories, but in the bones of ships, in the silence beneath the waves. Now that we've explored the hardships of pirate life and the dark mystery of a sunken treasure, let us shift our view to the shore, to dry land, where candlelight flickers in well-appointed rooms and the scent of imported tea lingers on the air. We find ourselves not in a ship's hold or on a storm-tossed deck, but inside a colonial governor's mansion, somewhere in 18th century Williamsburg or perhaps Charleston or Boston. The air here is still, polished. The ceilings are high, the floors gleam with wax, and the walls are lined with portraits and imported wallpaper from London or Paris. This was the life of the colonial elite, those appointed by the crown to oversee far-flung territories, to maintain order, and to embody civilization itself in the wilderness of the New World. Governors, their wives, and their children lived lives that could seem untouched by hardship, but beneath the surface, their days were tightly choreographed performances, every action part of a careful dance of power, class, and appearance. Let's start in the morning. Servants, often enslaved people or indentured staff, were up long before sunrise, tending fires, preparing breakfast, polishing boots, and brushing out wigs. The governor, when he finally awoke, would be greeted with a basin of water, and perhaps a glass of claret or coffee. His clothes would be laid out for him. Silk stockings, breeches, a waistcoat with silver buttons, each piece carefully maintained, because appearance was everything. Mornings were reserved for correspondence and meetings, long letters to London, ledgers to review, visitors from the local assembly, merchants, or other gentlemen might arrive to discuss matters of trade, taxation, or legal disputes. Each exchange had to be handled with precision. Too cold, and you insult. Too friendly, and you lose authority. Downstairs, the governor's wife was equally busy, managing the household, supervising the staff, and preparing for the day's social obligations. Midday meals, luncheons were formal, often multi-course affairs served on fine china with glassware shipped from Europe. Dishes might include roasted game, stewed fruits, or delicate pastries made with precious white sugar, harvested by enslaved labor in the Caribbean. The mansion itself was a symbol, a statement to visitors and locals alike that the British Crown's power was present, cultured, and enduring. Walls were painted in fashionable colors, rich blues, deep greens, or buttercream yellow. Books lined the library shelves, like Shakespeare, law manuals. The music room contained a harpsichord or violin. Candles were replaced often, their wax costly but necessary to maintain the illusion of endless abundance. But this curated life was not without its anxieties. The governor was never truly free. He was watched by both the crown above and the colonists below. He was expected to enforce unpopular laws, taxes, restrictions, trade limits, even when he disagreed with them. One misstep, one poorly handled riot or scandal, and his reputation, even his career, could vanish. And beneath every fine rug and silver dish was the reality that this life depended on others' labor. Servants, who had no freedom, no wealth, no voice. At night, when the house quieted, the governor might walk the garden paths, thinking of home, real home, back in England. Even the grandest mansion could feel like a gilded cage. And as the winds of revolution began to stir, many governors would eventually be driven out, their portraits defaced, their loyalist neighbors in hiding, or left to crumble in ivy and dust. Yet for a time, life inside these houses offered the illusion of stability, of refinement, of order amid chaos, far from the blood and salt of the high seas. But just like the Wider's cannons, just like a pyrus cutlass, the mansion's polished doorknobs and crystal chandeliers were tools of empire. Different feel, same result. So now, as we let the past drift gently into silence, you've traveled through salt and shadow, wind and wealth. You've scrubbed the deck of a pirate ship, your hands raw with brine. You've stood beside Blackbeard himself, a living storm in human shape. You've imagined the cold hush of the seafloor, where a doomed ship whispers its story in coral and ruin. And you've walked, quietly, through paneled hallways beneath chandeliers, where power was performed and civility was crafted like fine porcelain. Each world, so different, and yet connected by trade winds and treasure, by empire and ambition, by the simple fact that no matter how grand or grim, every person in history was once simply alive, working, enduring, dreaming, surviving. And now, as you lie still, perhaps wrapped in quiet and comfort, let your mind soften its grip on these stories. Let the creak of the pirate ship fade. Let the clink of fine china dissolve into stillness. Let the sea go still and the house go dark. The past is a far-off place, and you, dear listener, are safely here. Breathe in and out. There's nothing left to do. No more storms to brave, no more cannons to fire, no more boots to polish. Just rest, deep and calm. And perhaps we'll meet again in the quiet corners of history, where even the most restless lives have finally found peace. Good night, and thank you for listening to The Sleepy Historian.